Members, thank you. Finally, we've formed a quorum. Please invite the administration and the deputations to come in now. Chairman of the Development Panel, Mr. Tommy John, would like me to chair the meeting. Do we agree? Okay, then I will continue to chair the meeting. Please invite the administration and deputations to come in. We will continue to receive views on proposed enhancements to the general ex-gratia compensation and rehousing arrangements for government's development clearance exercise, and also Hit 711 B78TZL, the Wang Chau PRH Development and Infrastructure. We have already met for 6 hours on the 26th of June and will continue to meet with deputations. 17 have registered to come. May I remind deputations and individuals that you have each up to 3 minutes to speak, and you may use the earpiece and microphone on the table in front of you. Your written and verbal submissions are not protected by the Electoral Powers and Privileges Ordinance. May I draw your attention to the guidelines for the public security in relation to security measures for those attending meetings of the Electoral. We have already attached a copy to you in our invitation letter, and there is also another copy tabled. If need be, you can approach our staff present. And if you have prepared a speaking note, please put down your name and give it to our staff before you leave. For members' information, I will invite our deputations to speak according to the seating plan. Only one has arrived so far, Mr. Law Kim Hang. Mr. Law Kim Wai. Mr. Law Kim Wai. Or rather, Mr. Chiu Ming Shun. Thank you. I am an affected resident in Kutong Village. On the 10th of May, 2018, the Development Bureau announced the latest CNR arrangements. There will be a non-means tested arrangements for Type B of housing societies rehousing estates. However, for Pack 4 low package, there is no sign of works starting at the site yet. So I'd like to know when the administration will rehouse the affected residents, and there will be extra expenses on the part of the affected households. Has the administration considered their affordability? They might have met they might have exceeded the income or asset limit for PRH, but that doesn't mean that these households can afford high rent. If they would like to move, if they could afford alternative housing, they would not have put up with the current residents where traffic is inconvenient and there are mosquitoes and so on and so forth. For instance, will someone be willing to accept the invitation to live in a flat? Yes, take your time.
Well, to a well-decorated restaurant for meals, and yet the meal will be ordered by the government, and you pay the bill. You have no idea of the costs. Who will be foolish enough to say that they are satisfied with the proposal? I hope that the government can understand that to reach a consensus, you need to have a reasonable justification first. And thirdly, agriculture park. Can the government consider in Long Yuen make arrangements for a resumption of agriculture and give priority to farmers in Yuen Long North and Putong North, so that these farmers can have a seamless transition and the livelihood can be ensured. Fourthly, transportation. The development areas actually face busy traffic. I have reason to believe that during the period of development and in the wake of development, traffic congestion will only be more serious. Can the government ensure that after development, the traffic flow will be smooth? I also like to point out that the proposed developments cost the government a huge, large number, many months. And in 2014, your compensation is based on estimates based on in that year. But have you considered, because of the delay in the whole project, would you consider relaxing the residency restriction of those affected to the beginning of the development construction project? Okay, now any response from the administration? I'd like to thank Mr. Chu for your views. On Mr. Chu's points, I'd like to address them. Right now, the housing authorities' housing estate for resettlement won't be actually ready till 2023-2024. Mr. Chu, you may have missed it. We explained it already. That is next year. We hope that we can get the budget to do the clearance work. And with the housing authority, we have reached a consensus. Before 2023-24, if their households are willing to be rehoused, then they will be relocated to housing estates built by the housing authority, either new or vacant units in existing housing estates. Up to them. After a few years, by 2023-2024, when Backwall low units are available, if the residents concerned want to move back, they have the choice. Say for Bushak Wu, or if they like living there and they don't want to move again, then they can choose to stay. Point one. And point two is for means test. I agree with Mr. Chu, and that's exactly the government's view. That in many squatters, occupiers of squatters, particularly the elderly, because their asset level exceed the requirements of the housing authority. I don't mean that they are very rich, but I know they're struggling still. But if you say, you know that we have the enhanced arrangement now, under it, eligible occupiers can be rehoused without being means tested. Public rental housing is, of course, a rare commodity, very valuable. So if they don't want to be subject to means test, then they will have to live in other housing. But the housing authority will consider their financial situation. If they found that they are having financial difficulties, then the authority can make special arrangements. For agriculture, the resumption of farming, we have some arrangements made in that regard. But can we make sure we can help every single affected farmer? May not be the case. But if there's time, I will ask my colleague to supplement. As for traffic condition, in implementing a new development area, the government tries very hard to make sure the traffic is all right. We have conducted various TIAs, and particularly in the beginning or the early days of a development area that's up and running. The actual members criticized it before. They talk about the adequate provision of community facilities. We knew about that. So in Kutong North, Fannan North, new development areas will strive to overcome whatever traffic problems there may be. Thank you, Secretary. So members, now your time to respond. You can ask questions. Yik Chin Ming Shu Kafa, Regina Yip, Na Yu Chung Chen Chung Tai, Luk Chung Hong, each will have 5 minutes. Mr. Yik first. Thank you, Chairman. Secretary, the brownfields. We all know we need more housing here, units here. And people say that why don't you just use brownfields for development? I'm concerned about that because we all know that there is economic value in the businesses conducted in brownfields. If you remove the occupants, then that will have an impact on, people in the logistics or transportation industries. But I'm very pleased early on that, as you said, well, you have relaxed the criteria that they should have. Now you've changed the requirement from 10 years to 7 years of operation. But people ask me, why is it for people living in squatters, the residency requirement is 2 years? So why is it that for those operating in brownfields, the restriction has to be 7 years? Another question is, I'd like to ask you whether the 7 years can be, that is calculated on the basis of occupancy within the same district, even in different areas, but within the same district. Is that okay? That's question 2. The third question is, I'd like to ask about, I don't know whether you've done your consultancy study. I'm looking forward to receiving it on, the survey on operations in brownfields to see whether the multi-story warehouses you're going to build could accommodate people affected, those who are now operating in brownfields. If it's not adequate, then can the open-air operations accommodate those affected occupants? As I said, if the industries are affected, they will have an impact on other kinds of businesses too. Secretary, let me answer your third question first. I need to make things clear. As for the study itself, is still being done. By the end of this year, we'll see whether we can release the outcome and report back to you here. Well, I'd like to make it clear, however, that for brownfields, we recognize its economic value, and neither do we feel that Hong Kong can do without logistics industries now carried out in brownfields. But similar to the case of farmlands, whether, say, now if we resume a 1 hectare brownfields and exchange it for another 1 hectare brownfields later on, I met with some operators in the logistics industry. I told them we cannot have that kind of exchange because land is so valuable. We need to use it to satisfy more social needs. Operational efficiency of brownfields needs to be improved. In the case of Hong Shui Q, in the development area there, we resumed 180 hectares of brownfields. And what we can offer in return for logistics is about 60 hectares. It's a ratio of 1/3. So will there be any operators who can get a compensation but not continue operations? That could happen. So in the 60 hectares of brownfields we've identified, we would expect those brownfields to have a high operational efficiency. Some brownfields are not having high efficiency. So every time I like to stress this. And also, people who are operator in the same district but have moved from location to another, is there room for us to calculate their residency or occupancy period on the basis of that? That's okay. There's room for that. And because economic activities can adjust faster than human beings, so we don't think that we should draw the same line for everyone. We feel that for an economic activity, now it used to be 10 years, now it's reduced to 7 years. If we reduce it further to 2 years, then we are worried that this could lead to abuses. So that's the government view. Follow-up question. Secretary, you said that you mentioned about the operational efficiency in brownfields. I know if you have scattered fields, then the efficiency is limited. But if you have well-planned relocation, then I'm sure efficiency can be enhanced. So I'm not insisting on 1-to-1 ratio. I agree there are priorities in the society, but people have housing, but they still need to make a living. Because if business is closed, then people can't make a living. They cannot pay the rents. Next one is Shu Ka Fai. Thank you. I think we are meant to have a public hearing today, but so many people registered and yet only one turned up. I think the secretary has to consider what happened. I think on Tuesday, the same thing happened. Many people had registered, but the number of deputations who turned up were limited. So did they just register or did they not care about this? I just want to express my view here. And secondly, we are talking about land uses. We all know we don't have enough land here. And many people are focusing their attention on the new territories, land there that could have been or being used as squatters or farmlands. And there have been so much controversy over it, and it led to difficulties in resuming land. Ultimately, it's about rehousing and compensation deals. I know the government's latest compensation for squatter residents, the residents will be exempted from means test and be rehoused in public rental housing. This could reduce conflicts. Those who have lived there for so long, and if they can be resettled in public housing, then that's good. I just want to ask, however, many people know in the squatters, if people get the idea that once you have occupied squatters, then you would end up being given public housing without being subject to means test. So would there be a chance for squatters being speculated on? Has the government noticed that possibility? And also, will you have a comprehensive review of the squatters across Hong Kong? Just register them, the people that are living there. Now, because if you have this loophole created, then what about what could it have? What is the impact? Would it attract more people scrambling to occupy squatters? So, Secretary, what do you think? Thank you, Mr. Xu, for your question. We have noticed the possibility in the Tuesday meeting. The chairman said it too. I think you pointed precisely about our concern that every time when the government provides enhanced arrangements, that is to relax some arrangements, enabling occupants of squatters to be rehoused more easily or get better compensation, we would still carefully consider whether what that would lead to, as Mr. Xu said, resulting in people scrambling to buy squatters. So we have provided for a number of measures to avoid that from happening. Firstly, in our enhanced arrangements, there's one principle that we stick strictly to. I hope that members can agree. And this arrangement has never been criticized. If you're not living in numbered house, that is, you have not been registered, then if you're not living in a registered quarter, the rehousing compensation arrangement will not apply. What they can get will only be a removal allowance for those who are not living in a numbered squatter. For the eligible occupants of numbered squatters, we still have a restriction on the number of years that they've lived there.
We will consider the period of time he has lived there, he has been living there prior to our survey. But we'll be a bit, we'll relax the restrictions a little bit. Now, if you only start to live there today, you will not be eligible for the proposed enhancements. And we've also relaxed the criteria to cover non-domestic squatters. We will have a one-off or snapshot registration. We will register both the structure as well as the occupant, and that's also mentioned by Ms. Alice Mack, the chair, last time. We don't want squatters to mushroom in the NT, because we will not be able to cope, and I agree with Mr. Shiu's observation, and we will certainly take care of this as we move forward. I hope the administration can come up with a survey outcome as soon as possible. To be fair, we cannot evict those quarters, but if we allow more to come to stay, then it is not fair. May I respond to Mr. Shiu? It's not that deputations do not care enough to come. The original scheduled meeting was Tuesday, and then we could not accommodate more hundreds or so deputations, and so today is an extra slot. Some of the deputations may not be able to come this morning. We have to be considerate. Mrs. Regina Ip, I'd like to follow up on Mr. Frankie Yick's point. Perhaps I didn't hear the reply clearly. When will the survey on brownfields be completed? The government started the survey or the study too late. It didn't do it in the last term, and I'd like to know how much longer it's going to take to complete the study. Secretary, we hope that judging from the current progress, we'll be able to complete it by the end of this year. Will that cover multi-story warehouses? I think there are two studies. First is a survey or a study of the current status of brownfields in Hong Kong. Mr. Eddie, you may recall this. 2 years ago, if you asked us how many brownfields we have, we couldn't answer because we were not sure. But if you ask us now, we expect there will be about 1,300 hectares. It's just a guesstimate. By the time the study is completed, we will have a clearer idea on the total area and distribution of brownfield sites in Hong Kong. And Mrs. Regina Ip asked whether we can have multi-story buildings to accommodate brownfield users. This is because of shortage of land in Hong Kong. Now, we have some challenges. Not all operations can be relocated to multi-story blocks. Some users may not be accommodated there. What are these users? For instance, if they need a big crane to operate, then for multi-story buildings, there is always limitations to the clearance height, and also it also depends on the loading. And then fiscal feasibility is also another issue. If we just rely on the market, rely on market forces, there may not be sufficient capital investment, and we have to consider whether the government will have to help the recurrent expenditure. And I don't want to preempt the outcome of the study, but these are factors we have to consider. Mrs. Regina Ip, I think the proposed enhancements have at least addressed some of the concerns of residents in North District, and also rehousing without the means-tested arrangement. I'd like to know whether these enhancements will apply to all future cases, and also not just to villages in the NT, but those on Hong Kong Island. We have Samway village and Pak Fulong village. When the time comes for these villages on Hong Kong Island to be cleared, because land on Hong Kong is more in Hong Kong is more expensive, are you going to do that or enhance the compensation? We have gone through a long period of discussion with the community, and I have said in this council a number of times that at first the aspirations were mainly on two fronts. First, as I answered Mr. Chiu's query, there may be elderly persons living in squatters with income or asset limits higher than those set by the housing society. They may not necessarily be well off. So we have relaxed the criterion. Second, the compensation of $0.6 million, although not everyone could get the maximum, but still it has been fixed a long time ago, and we have addressed the amount of EGAs. And we've also got the approval of the EXCO. So further adjustments is, the likelihood is not high, but of course we can't be too rigid or too fixed. But let me say that further enhancements are not very likely. We have to ensure that we use public resources properly. All right. If you take into account squatters on Hong Kong Island, and I don't know whether there are any in Kowloon, how many are there in total? Thank you. For non-domestic and domestic structures in the whole of Hong Kong, there should be about 300,000. But for those that require enhanced compensation, would be those that face clearance. That is, a clearance exercise is needed because of a proposed development. In our paper to the administration, to the council, we mentioned that there would be about 8,000 squatters that will be demolished because of proposed developments. Thank you. Mr. Leung Yu Chong, to be followed by Dr. Cheng Chung Tai. Thank you. I hope the administration understands that villagers live there peacefully and happily. Now you want to clear their squatters, and that would mean a major change to their current status. And this change can never be duly compensated because they cannot continue their current way of life. So we have a very simple concept. In Hong Kong, where I am living here, and you force me to go, of course you must give me more generous compensation to serve as an incentive for me to leave. However, you are not providing any incentive. You just give me something and force me to go. Some villagers talked about no relocation and no demolition, and you told them that that was not government policy. And some villagers asked for the whole village to be re-provisioned, and they would like to retain their current lifestyles, such as farming. And can you reconsider allowing the whole village to be relocated? Choi Yuen village may be an exceptional case, but for the current case, can you adopt relocation of the whole village as a basic arrangement? And the cash EGAs are very complicated. In North East NT is $0.6 million, and you have to take into account the size and other factors. Take Wang Chau as an example. Even with the cash EGAs, not all of the villagers will be eligible. Only about 50% of them will be eligible. And what will happen to the remaining 40% that are not eligible? And the calculation of cash EGA is very complicated. You have to take into account the size, and on average, they may get $1.2 million. That may sound generous, but for a 1,000, we rarely have a squatter that is 1,000 square feet in size. So very few will get really $1.2 million. For smaller squatters, they can only get $0.4 million. That is even less than $0.6 million. So why don't you uniform the cash EGA? Because you are creating troubles for villages, and you also have administrative red tape. And why is it so complicated? Why can't you take into account, why can't you use family as a basis for compensation?
Secretary,
thank you. If we are moving forward, given the land is so scarce in Hong Kong, multi-story developments will be the way forward. I have talked about this a number of times, and Mr. Leung Chi-Chiang also asked whether we could relocate the whole village. I said that it was not feasible, it was not sustainable. I think Mr. Leung here understands that Chuk Yuen Chun was an exceptional case, and the government made it very clear back then. Second, whether we can take care of all the affected households. We cannot guarantee all the squatters can be rehoused. I have made this very clear. When I answered Mr. Frankie Yick's question on brownfield sites, I also said that even if compensation is granted, the operator may not be able to find land to continue his current operation, because in reality we don't have so much land. Otherwise we wouldn't have to start the clearance exercise at all. And Mr. Leung talked about the cash EGAs. The criteria are very simple. First, the duration of living there, and second, the size of the structures. We've never said that all affected households will be granted $1.2 million. There are still a number of conditions to be satisfied. The current arrangement is enhanced. Theoretically speaking, the cash EGA should be more than was originally granted. Now, if it is lower, then under the current arrangement, we would keep the $0.6 million that would be granted to the squatters in the first place. All right. We have to use public money carefully. Dr. Cheng Chung Tai. In Yuen Long South and Kwu Tung North, has the administration consider doing a freezing survey first? Because for Kwu Tung North in 2014, the estimated value may be different now. The government is planning to resume them in Tin Kwang Po and Long Valley or Long Yuen. Now, the households live in Tin Kwang Po, that is in Yuen Long, and their farm is in Kwu Tung. So you acquire their farmland but not their house, and so you will only be made aware of the various details when you start the whole exercise. So I think for all farming households and ordinary households, you should do the freezing survey first. I know they may be surveyed or licensed structures, but some of them may just be subtenants. They may not be the owner or the original registered occupant. They have lived there for many years, and many of them are grassroots. I've visited them a number of times. So for rehousing of farmers at Long Valley and Tin Kwang Po, you have resumed their farmland but not their structures. So you have taken away their means of livelihood. They rely on farming to support themselves. So what will happen to them? So will you conduct a freezing survey first? This is a very direct question.
Thank you. As we said earlier on, I think Mr. Chang mentioned Kwu Tung North and Yuen Long South. In Kwu Tung North, the island zoning plan has been done. And as I said, in our phase 1 development, we want to begin it next year. I mentioned these 2 points already. For the remaining phases, we'd like to compress them as much as possible. And if during the following phases for households affected, if they want to move out of the squatters area, but they want to vacate their squatters for rehousing, then we would ensure that that can happen. I can't promise that it will be all finished in phase 1, but if there are households like to move out earlier, then even if the clearance hasn't happened, we'd like to still grant their wish. For Yuen Long South, our zoning plan is still being worked on, so we need to wait till the zoning plan is finalized. When we know the scope of the new development areas, then can we begin the clearance work. Mr. Chang, well, whether we can have registration before clearance, and also whether we can arrange for voluntary residents who are eligible. We've got the conversation to be rehoused. We are willing to accommodate that. Yuen Long South. Well, you haven't done the outline zoning plan yet. Well, after the last public hearing, I found out that in Yuen Long South, the villages there have no idea about the planning and how does it affect them. The household there really don't know what's going to happen to them. So would you try perhaps right now find social workers in Yuen Long South like the Lutheran teams to contact them first and find out about the situation there? Villages know they may be rehoused, but in Kutong North or Long Yun, the farmers where they live, well, they know that where they live, their dwellings will not be affected, and yes, it's only their farmlands that will be resumed. So you need to let the people know exactly what's going to happen and which places will be cleared. Secretary, thank you, Mr. Chen. I think we can do a bit more work. That is to make it clearer to the people that the Alliance Zoning Plan is going to be finished. I know, Mr. Chen, you've been to the Town Planning Board. Once the plan is out, any stakeholders affected, they are entitled to speaking their minds at Town Planning Board meetings. I think we can step up our publicity to let people know about the arrangement. And we do encourage people to say or to present in person to TPB their views or concerns. And the other matters will need to be resolved later. Thank you, Chairman. For people affected by development and rehousing and clearance, we need to have a people-oriented principle, and the government's enhanced arrangements have already addressed people's commands. But there's still a few points I'd like to make. Firstly, for those who are exempted from means test for rehousing in housing authority flats, I'd like to know about your criteria for rehousing. What is the per capita space allowed for? You may think that squatters, are squatters, but then some people living there may find them quite spacious. So will there be a big difference between the per capita living space between public housing and squatters? And as for the ex-gratia cash allowance, $1.2 million as the ceiling is a lot than before, but it's not easy for one to get the whole sum because they would have to be living in a squatter of more than 1,000 square feet in size. So is there any room for further relaxation or to set a lower limit? Because the minimum now is 100,000 or even less than that using your criteria. So could you possibly set a lower limit? And for the ex-gratia payment arrangement, for the holders of license of squatters and the occupants of squatters, will they have the same rights? That is, say there is a compensation of $1.2 million. Will the amount be shared equally by the licensees and the tenants? It's not, I think, it's clearly explained. I don't get it in the paper. Secretary, I'll try to answer your questions, Mr. Look. For arrangement for rehousing in housing authority flats, on the size of the flats is not dependent on the original size of the squatter, but rather on the number of people in the household. You may be familiar, for 3 to 4 people family, the size is about 300 square feet. So it's all based on the number of people in the household. $1.2 million, as I explained just then to the government, we need to make sure that we are making good use of public money. We believe that the latest arrangement for allowance would allow most people to get more than before. Because it's not just about the amount itself. There is the requirement on years of residence, and there are bandings as well. But we have relaxed the criteria. The government never said that each household will be entitled to $1.2 million. That's very clear. In my answer to another question, at this stage, we have considered the fact that for various projects in our contact with stakeholders, and we have actually taken into account the views of stakeholders throughout the years. So there's really a low possibility for further revisions in the arrangements. For the license holders issue, I'll hand it over to PS. PS for squatters, because they are allowed to exist on a temporary basis. So there isn't this concept of ownership associated with it. For rehousing of squatters, our focus of attention is always on the occupants when it comes to compensation, not so much the landlords. As for licensed squatters, that is, squatters given special licenses offered in the past, usually speaking, the occupants should be related to the licensees. Say they could be family members, so we deal with them in accordance with existing policy. But for the licensed squatters, what if they have been subdivided for different tenants, like over a period of 20, 30 years? So the holder of the license would they be compensated, or will compensation be offered to the occupants? I think it should be occupants oriented, because the spirit of the whole arrangement is to help people living there be given cash allowance or rehoused, so that if they have the cash allowance, then they can rent a flat of similar size for some period of time. So that's the spirit behind. So we'll try to help the occupants. But they have to be occupants who are already there, registered during the freezing survey. Next one is Kwakaki. The government's proposal, of course, is an improvement in itself, but I believe that all residents affected, most of them, will feel that it's never enough compensation. And they have been trying to get, like, take the example of Wang Chau, phase 2, phase 3, whether they can be rehoused in some areas there. So, like in the case of Choi Yun Estate or Choi Yun Chun, if not, then can they be rehoused in new estates built by HK SA or HK Hong Kong Housing Society? I believe that brownfields themselves, as mentioned by the Secretary, actually could be owned by developers or damaged by developers on purpose. Let's not try to figure out the reasons behind, but they're just people trying to create economic value in the brownfields for the sake of getting higher compensation from the government. So I believe that some brownfields are really needed, say, for the purpose of, storing cranes or construction materials. But some brownfields are used for storing rubbish. You should be more familiar with me. For phase 2, phase 3, the brownfields are used for storing recycled materials or waste. So the government needs to do two things. You say that by the end of the year, a research study will be finished. So could you freeze the study at the same time, however? Because otherwise the issue will not go away. By the time the land is vacant, the parties concerned may use all means to lobby the government to get what they want. Ultimately, they just want to take back the land to build residential flats. In the paper, it said that there's a voluntary registration period. I don't know what you mean by voluntary registration. Because every time such registration happens, it only creates problems. Is it that problems will go away? I think I'd like to focus on brownfields. For rehousing, the affected people will need to show proof. But for people using brownfields, with no obviously high economic value, will the government also carry out a registration? If it's voluntary, then what if people don't want to register and bargain with the government? So why doesn't the government carry out a territory-wide registration for maybe even squatters as well? Only that will be fair. At the last meeting, I heard that some members said that when the government wants to resume the squatters, then the landlords could drive out the tenants and then rent out the spaces at high prices. So you had the registration before, so why can't you have another round of it now? For Wang Chau Phase 2, Phase 3 development, later on I will ask the Transport and Housing Bureau to answer. And then on your other question, whether we can arrange for people to move to another housing estate for rehousing, I think for the government, we think that house for house is not a sustainable method looking ahead. With such land shortage in Hong Kong, inevitably, we need to build high rises. Therefore, in our enhanced proposal, we are targeting elderly people who are living in squatters, whose asset may exceed the means test. They're not rich, but we still try to help them be rehoused. Well, Fernando John just stepped out, but last time he said that whether we can have maybe that's what you meant, Mr. Kwok, whether we can have a vertical arrangement so that they could be rehoused and live together. The first dedicated estate will be in Bak Wah Lo, Fanland, and the other will be in Hong Shui Kyu. Dedicated estates. Please continue. But it's just that there are time gaps. In Bak Wah Lo, they won't be ready till 2023-24. So what happened in the coming few years? Because we expect the clearance to start in 2019. So the Housing Authority has come up with a transitional arrangement for residents affected by redevelopment. They can choose to live in or move to new or existing housing estates in the next few years. There could be some empty units as well in Housing Authority estates. So they have that option. And we have provided for adequate feasibility. By 2023-24, when the Bak Wah Lo dedicated estate is ready, then the households could choose to move there. If they want to stay in Bo Set Wu and don't want to move, then that's their choice. So that's the arrangement for them to be rehoused together. For some households, they may think that the living environment, it may not be as good as what they are having now, but the things are not ideal. For the study on Wang Chau Phase 2, Phase 3 development, I'll hand over the time to my colleague.
Under Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Dr. Kwok, for your question. Phases 2 and 3 of the study have started. We expect them to be completed by the end of 2019. And that will form the blueprint for the next step planning. We have 13,000 flats planned, and the study would cover water, supplies, drainage, sewage, traffic, and so forth. In the subsequent phases, we're going to provide 13,000 PRH units. What about the registration? Please be brief. The registration is mainly for non-domestic structures. Ms. Ling would supplement. Yes, we are going to have a one-off registration for non-domestic structure because in fact, turning a non-domestic structure to domestic use can be subject to enforcement. However, this time round, to ensure that occupants living in non-domestic structures can be compensated, we do not want to encourage people to continue to break the law, and therefore we encourage a one-off voluntary registration. What about brownfields? You have overrun severely. We will provide a written reply later. I know Mr. Chiu, one deputation is here and he would like to supplement. I'll give you 2 minutes. I know some members would still want to speak, but I don't want to keep Mr. Chiu waiting. Mr. Chiu. Thank you, Madam Chair. We thank the government for giving us residual rehousing in Kutong North. We want the whole process to be expedited. We understand that the new scheme would affect households to be affected in the future. I hope the administration can enhance the arrangements as far as possible. Please do not wait. When social workers have to help these affected households for compensation or compassionate rehousing. Now, for our parents, we are worried that our children will have to grow up waiting for compensation. I'm afraid that these children, when they are grown up and when they work, when they start their working life, they may have this wrong mentality. They think that they can get things without paying for them. And so please do not use the government's safety net to resolve problems. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chiu. Thank you for your attendance. You may be excused if you choose to. Thank you. Well, we thank Mr. Chiu's valuable comments. We will try our best. Mr. Wilson, the community has a great demand for housing. The CE will announce a major initiatives today. Well, all along we've been talking about land, which is the flower, the ingredient for building flats. When we want to resume land, then occupants and residents will have different requests. We thank the administration for accepting DAB's suggestion for non-means tested housing arrangements. However, I'd like to see clarification on several points. First, rehousing. Many deputations would like to have in situ rehousing. In fact, the total number of flats available in Yuen Long for in situ rehousing is limited. Even for Hong Shui Kiu NDA flats may not be available in time for rehousing. So I'd like to ask the administration how are you going to achieve this target of in situ rehousing? And we understand that there are different and special cases. Will the Development Bureau has guidelines for dealing with special cases? And what special factors will you deploy to ensure that they can be properly rehoused? And the third question is for Mr. So, the Undersecretary for Housing. We understand that Housing Society will be responsible for providing flats in dedicated estates, but to a certain extent we need the help of Housing Authority as well, because the Housing Authority would have flats, recovered flats, and also flats for rehousing. I'd like to know whether Housing Society has reserved flats for rehousing purpose. If yes, how many? If not, where can you find flats? Because once there are adjustments to the housing supply, then people will be affected. People on the waiting list and also affected households will be affected. I will ask follow-up questions after these questions are addressed. Thank you. We want to make better arrangements when it comes to in situ rehousing. Now, if they may not be rehoused within a few minutes walk from the current sites, but we will have dedicated estates planned. We may have to make use of existing housing estates or planned estates of the housing society. Now, if I live in Yuen Long, when it comes to rehousing, some households may accept rehousing in Shangshui or Fanling. And for discretionary cases, because we are talking about discretion, we cannot lay down all the criteria. Otherwise, this is a regular arrangement and not discretion at all. When there are different cases or special cases, so social workers will help. When legislators or district councillors come across special cases, they will refer them to us and we will try our very best to accommodate. But it is hard for us to list out principles for discretionary treatment. I think the overriding principle is to consider the major difficulty and see whether we can help. Mr. So, I thank Mr. Oh for his question. Regarding arrangements by HA and HS, as Mr. Wang Weilun said, in Park Hua Lo and Hong Shui Kiu South, we will build estates, housing estates. Pending completion of these estates, these residents can choose to live in existing flats of HA of HS for the time being. If subsequently they would rather stay in these temporary accommodation, they are welcome to do so. The number of flats available for allocation differs from year to year. For instance, this year we have reserved 350 flats to households affected by clearance and demolition, and we've also got a few hundred cases for compassionate arrangements. The arrangements will depend on the actual circumstances, and we will not have a ceiling. Thank you. Secretary, I hope when you deal with special cases, you can take into account the following two principles. First, be people-oriented. This is most crucial. Secondly, for special cases, they are always handled by officials above the rank of assistant director. I'd like to know in future whether that will be the same. Please give us a reply later. Mr. Andrew Wen, thank you. I have a few questions. I understand that the proposed enhancements would be submitted to the FC in July for approval. But what about enhanced EGAs to brownfield sites? Will the arrangements be submitted to the FC for approval in July? If not, please give us the reasons. Now, other than the NT, we have urban areas where there will also be clearance exercises. And these affected households may also be affected by the proposed enhancements. But so far, our discussion has focused on the NT. So what about a space under staircases in the urban areas, can there be briefings to them so that they know whether they will be able to benefit under the new arrangements? For outdoor operators and also compensation to them, yes, we would apply for FC's approval in July. We haven't had too much discussion on them because deputations and individuals already mentioned them, with the exception of Mr. Frankie Yik. He asked why it should be 7 years and not 2 years. I explained to him already. For urban areas, usually clearance in the urban areas will arise from URA projects, Urban Renewal Authority. I think there is still room for a better communication with stakeholders, operators under staircases, and also the rooftop occupants. I think it's very easy. Ask HAD staff to organize briefings for districts with these cases. I think we mentioned at the last meeting that there were squatters in urban areas as well. So I hope publicity can be extended to these places so that they will understand that they are also eligible. They can also come forward to register on a voluntary basis. Thank you for your reminder. I still have time. Yes, to be fair, we can commend your proposed enhancements because you have taken on board some of our suggestions, but there is still room for further improvement. For instance, I left in the latter half of the session last time, so I don't know whether these questions have been answered. Family members, their asset can be exempted from the means test, but what about properties owned by family members? You know, some households have lived there for decades. Some of their family members might already be property owners and not living here. Can they have their names removed? Now, if a household has got an adult children and financially independent, there's the possibility of splitting the household. Madam Lin, I think Mr. Andrew Wen understands that you cannot be a property owner if you're eligible for compensation, and HS and HA have flexible arrangements, and what we propose here is our usual practice. A deputation told us last time that there was a 7P household and one family member owns a property. Will that render all 7 family members ineligible for the non-means tested housing in dedicated estates? Now, if there are adults in a household, if they are financially independent, then there is arrangement for under HA for splitting the household. So there are ways to deal with that. Thank you. Dr. Fernando Zhang. Thank you. We said last time that if flat for flat or house for house rehousing is not required, then even if you cannot develop or re-provision horizontally, you can consider vertical in situ rehousing. You can also consider, because the current public-private partnership model has created a lot of problems.
Developers have halted lands, and after a development plan was announced, residents staying on their private lands face more hardships. So from land resumption to compensation, now you're enhancing your arrangements. I think for those living on privately owned land, whether they're villagers or farmers, elderly people, they are in a difficult situation because it would become a kind of private conflicts, like in the case of Marcy Po. Last meeting, deputation said that Henderson Land has already begun works there, making it difficult for them to remain at the site. When it rains, then the muddy water floods into their households. So this is the kind of issues that you will see when redevelopment is about to happen. So residents actually for a long time have to bear with such kind of torture. So I'd like to ask you, as the former Secretary General of the Urban Renewal Authority, Mr. Tam, government's resumption of land, direct resumption of land is fairer than public-private partnership, because then actually you would also be spared from any accusation of collusion between officials and the private sector. So you can have a unified practice of just having land resumption in one go. Like in the case of Marcy Po, the residents there have told us their plight. Is there any way you can help them? And that is providing in situ rehousing? And you tell them that, well, they would not be worse off. But now, with the nuisances of construction works being carried out in the neighborhoods and also flooding in the areas, that kind of nuisances, can you help them? Offer any help to them to help them maintain the present way of life? Secretary. What is the best way to invoke land resumption ordinance? On Wednesday, I answered a question in Lashko on exactly this, but I'm not going to, repeat that in 20 minutes again. But a brief reply to Mr. Fernando Jura, to the government, for new development areas like Kwun Tung North or Fanning North, we are resuming 68 hectares of land and we process 2.4 hectares of land through land exchange. You can see that most of the land actually is taken back through resumption. We still need to use market force. The government is not all powerful. There are things that we still need to rely on civic or market forces in order to reach a better deal. Well, if you don't mind, I can show you my answer on Wednesday to let you have an idea of our rationale. In Marcy Po, as Mr. Chung said, you pointed out concrete issues there. In terms of the system, there are all sorts of protections of it. That is avoidance of noise and dust and entry-exit allowances. But I will still ask various government departments to look into the situation and see what kind of help we can provide to the residents affected. I think we need to deal with two papers. One is on the government's ex-gratia compensation and rehousing arrangements for government's development clearance exercises. And this paper was supported by members for it to be submitted to FC. And the other paper is on Henderson project number B780CL. So members, would you oppose submitting that paper to PWSC? Okay, if not, then we'll submit the paper to... Yes, the ex-gratia payment will be submitted to Finance Committee. The development panel supported it at the meeting on May 29. I just asked about the paper on HAT 1711 project number B780 COCL paper. So there's no objection from members, so the paper will be submitted to PWSC for discussion. So one paper will go to FC, the other paper will go to PWSC. There's no AOB, so I think that's the end of the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chu, for coming, and thank you, Administration, for coming.